Good evening, good afternoon, and depending on what time you're watching this. This is being recorded, and for those of you who are watching live, thanks for being here. My name is John Tommen, and this afternoon we're going to look at some information regarding your kids' health, what we as an organisation do in schools. We're going to look at some statistics, how the brain operates, and a lot of other good information. Prior to that, what I'd like to do is give a formal introduction to our organisation. My name is John Tommen. I work for FCD Prevention Works. We are a global non-profit substance abuse prevention organisation. For the past 41 years, we've worked with about 2 million students in about 70 countries. We see prevention as a climate, not a program, and so we talk about substance use through a health perspective. If you are watching this live, you feel free to write down any questions. If you are watching a recording, you can still ask questions to our organisation. There will be a link via, I think, YouTube, if I'm correct, and that way then we can have a conversation and keep it going. So if you have any thoughts or questions on anything I say as I speak, please jot down those questions for us. So what I'd like to do is just move on to the first slide. And again, I've just described our organisation. And by the way, when we say prevention is a climate, not a program, we as an organisation don't just go into a school with here's what to do and then walk out the door again. It doesn't work like that. When prevention is a climate, it means that everybody's on board regarding administration, faculty, parents, students, and any other staff that's in the school. If health is rewarded, we know the students who grow up in that environment are more likely to celebrate health, and also to see unhealthy behaviours as that not the norm. We know that changes the climate within a certain community. So what is prevention? Well, prevention is basically threefold. What we do is, as an organisation, and then disseminating that into the community, is we reduce the risks in a young person's life. We intervene on unhealthy behaviours. There's lots of ways of looking at that, and of course we nurture that which works in a young person's life. In other words, we look at the protective factors in a young person's life when we try to expand upon that. And that includes, of course, things like, say, academic achievements, which most students want to have, sports, school policy, laws, religious beliefs. So there's a lot of protective factors already in a young person's life, and what we want to do is introduce to that young person having this as a health perspective, so they internalize, which again becomes another protective factor. And what we do is we nurture those protective factors. When we do surveys, for example, and I'm going to show you some information on a kind of a global stage of all the students that we have surveyed to give you an idea on how alcohol affects a young person's lives. But the fact is, and this is a really important statement to make, that the vast majority of FC students make healthy, responsible decisions. And that's very important to remember as we go along. So, what is addiction? Well, addiction is classified as a disease. In other words, as a lot of diseases, it's primary. What do we mean by that? Primary means that a person doesn't get an addiction because of some other virus or some virus or some bacteria or from some other disease. It's a standalone disease. That's what we mean by primary. It's progressive, which means that it can only get worse. When addiction is on its road, it progressively gets worse, which means that the person's behavior changes. Use might increase, might not increase, but the personality changes. When I say might not increase, it means that people can go through bouts of use and then fade away, maybe stop, and then reuse again. We call that binge drinking or binge using. So, addiction is not necessarily somebody using a substance 7 days a week. It doesn't work like that. It changes the operation of the brain. It's irreversible in the sense that when regarding progression, if a person was to have an addiction, even if they were to maintain sobriety for a lot of years, we have found over and over again that when somebody goes back and uses that substance again, they find it very hard to control that substance. When we say it's progressive, we also say that it's chronic. What do we mean by that? Chronic means it makes the person very ill. It changes personality, it changes attitudes, it changes perceptions and how a person might see their family, how they see their job. And that can be a very difficult thing for somebody who lives with somebody or who's a relative of somebody who has an addiction. So addiction is a disease. And of course the last part of it is it's primary, it's It's progressive, it's chronic, and for a lot of times it's fatal. Fatal means it will shorten a person's life. So for example, tobacco addiction is fatal. You know, the difference between a person's lifespan between being a smoker and a non-smoker in lots of cases is considerable length of time. So addiction is a disease. One of the things, by the way, we talk to your daughters and sons about that as a disease. We also talk about the risk factors for addiction. What do we mean by the risk factors? I might start off in the class by saying, what are the risk factors for catching a cold or a flu? Well, the answer is not washing your hands, risk factor. Being around other people who have colds and flus, risk factor. When it comes to addiction, because it's not a clear virus or bacteria, the risk factors a bit more complicated, but we do know what they are. And we know that addiction runs in families. So when we say family history, that is genetic and also environmental. And it's roughly about 50-50. So in other words, if a student in one of my classes has addiction in their family tree, it's not for me to find that out, but it's important that that student finds out for themselves. It's okay for a student to go home and ask, is there addiction in my family tree? And if there is addiction in that family tree, it means that that young person is at a higher risk for addiction. And I said that slowly to make sure that I didn't say high risk. It's not a high risk, it's a higher risk, because there's so many variables. Is it one person in the family tree? Is it two people? How close is it to the core family? Is it a grandparent? Is it an uncle, an aunt? Is it a cousin? But the fact remains that if there's addiction in the family tree, it means that a young person is at a higher risk compared to if there was no addiction in that family tree. How is age a risk for addiction? A 15-year-old who puts a drink into their mouth is roughly 4 to 5 times more likely to develop alcoholism than if they waited till they were 21. If it took 4 to 5 years for an adult to develop alcoholism, it would take between 12 and 18 months for that amount of alcohol use to develop an addiction in a young person's brain. 12 to 18 months compared to 4 to 5 years. Because when the brain is developing, it's far more susceptible, A, to damage done by chemicals, and B, there's a far greater reward for most actions and behaviors as a teenager than it is for an adult. Which means inside the brain, there's way more dopamine, a neurotransmitter which is part of the reward system. There's way more dopamine released in the brain as a teenager for the same amount of alcohol than an adult will drink. And teenagers typically have a higher tolerance to alcohol, which means that they suffer less hangovers than adults. So the reward is higher and the negative response is lower. And so there's more of an attraction to the brain to use again. So the bottom line is age is a risk factor for addiction. Cravings, what do we mean by cravings? Well, there's two types of cravings. There's the one which is addiction itself. For example, a compulsive gambler, all they do is walk into a store and see a scratch ticket and their brain lights up and they have a strong demand inside the brain to get something like a scratch ticket. If a smoker hasn't smoked for 2 hours, there's a strong demand in the brain for that person to receive more nicotine because they're withdrawn from nicotine. The craving we're really talking about here is when a young person is thinking about the weekend, for example, and they're looking forward to, say, going to a movie, going out on a date, playing lacrosse, going away with their family, or just maybe not even getting out of bed on a Saturday morning. If they feel good thinking about these things, their brain is rewarding a behavior that they're going to do in the future. They're rewarding them now for that. Where this ties into the risk factor of addiction. If a young person, say for example on a Thursday, is looking forward to Friday night and getting intoxicated from any substance, be it marijuana or alcohol, that means that young person is rewarding themselves now in anticipation for an action later. And if that action later is a drug, that's a risk factor for addiction right there. They're getting a reward before they even use it. And this one here, tolerance, is one that worries us a lot as an organisation simply because without clear knowledge of what tolerance is, a young person is typically would think that having a high tolerance is actually a protective factor. In other words, the ability to be able to drink a lot of alcohol without showing a negative response, where we know the opposite is true. If it took an adult 4 beers to get intoxicated and another adult 8 beers to get intoxicated, the person who takes 8 beers to get intoxicated is having an abnormal reaction to alcohol. They should have been intoxicated at 4 beers, but for some reason their body is able to metabolize the alcohol, and it takes longer for that person to get intoxicated. That person is more likely to be able to control their use of drinking in the short term, because they don't get drunk easy. But the problem, of course, is in order to get intoxicated, that person has to put a lot more alcohol into their system. And so therefore, having a high tolerance, should I say, is a risk factor. When we talk about surroundings, we're talking about TV, internet, magazines, barbecues, weddings, funerals, confirmations, bar mitzvahs. If a young person is brought up in an environment where alcohol is the norm in their life, it just means that statistically, that young person is at a higher risk for addiction than if that was not present in their life. So in other words, the more they see alcohol as the norm, the more normal they think alcohol use is. And that is actually a risk factor. Now, one of these on their own would not necessarily send somebody into addiction, but typically, a lot of people who develop addiction will have most of these risk factors in their life. I want to just spend a few minutes on e-cigarettes. I'd like you to look at this chart here. You see 6 e-cigarettes. One of them, if you know nothing about this one looks like a real cigarette to you. It's actually an electronic device. This black part here is a light, it's an LED light. This white part is a battery, and inside this chamber here, there's a microprocessor, there's a sensor, there's a piece of metal that heats up really hot, and there's the liquid that's poured, basically dropped onto this hot piece of metal, and it vaporizes it, which is why they're called vapes. All right, and this then is inhaled into the lungs. Statistically, more 8th graders use e-cigarettes than real cigarettes, and then students who use e-cigarettes are roughly 3 times more likely to start using real cigarettes than students who choose not to use e-cigarettes. They're unregulated, which means that they're manufactured in facilities that have not been, there's literally no oversight of them. They're basically the same device. Every one of those are the same device with different colors, of course. If you look at the colors and the designs of these are clearly marketed to young people. So what does the inside of one of these look like? Again, just to repeat, this is the cross section. There's the light, there's the battery, microprocessor, sensor, the coil that heats up, and this is where the propylene glycol, which is a food additive, and glycerin, which is a food additive, and other chemicals are mixed in with the nicotine. Some of these devices do not have nicotine in them, and for that reason, the feedback sometimes is this: well, it doesn't have an addictive drug in it, so therefore it is not as harmful. It's only water vapor. The answer to that is it's not water vapor. There is no water in these devices. When somebody exhales, anytime during the day you are exhaling water vapor. We just can't see it, but you can see it in the cold weather. All right. So that's. But mixing this vape with that breath, it's very easy to think that's just water vapor coming out of one person's mouth. The tiny particles that are vaporized here get into the lung sacs, and they can bypass the cilia, which are the hairs which bring stuff back up from your lungs. In other words, e-cigarettes are really not healthy for any young person. And as a parent, what we suggest is that if one of your sons or daughters says, yes, but they're not as bad as cigarettes, well, the problem with that argument is this: is one thing, no matter what we talk about in this world, we can say that something is not as bad as something else. When you talk about e-cigarettes with your children, what we suggest is you stick with e-cigarettes. And if they say it's not as bad as cigarettes, then you can suggest that maybe we can talk about cigarettes maybe after we're finished with e-cigarettes, but the comparisons are a slippery road into thinking that there's less risk involved. And ultimately, when a student thinks there's lower risk attached to a substance, they're more likely to use it. Now, at this point, do you have any questions, my friend, as we go on? Okay. Feel free to interrupt me. For those of you viewing, you cannot interrupt me, but typically what I say is if there are any questions, just give them to me at any time. So how does the teenage brain differ from the adult brain? I'll make this as short and sweet as possible by saying this: that the teenage brain has a larger impulse center. In other words, when they get an idea to do something, there's a stronger urge to carry out that thought. The teenage brain also has a prefrontal cortex that is not fully developed. And On average, the adult brain is fully developed at the age of 25. It is pretty close to 21, but at 18 it is nowhere near full development. It's very susceptible to damage from chemicals. It learns how to do any behavior very well, no matter what that behavior is, because of the hardwiring. So really, at the end of the day, the brain was designed or evolved, if you like, to fully form without the use of any chemicals. And any interruption in that can and does interfere with the process of that development. So really what we say as an organisation, we're not abstinence-based, we're more of postpone and delay. The more a young person postpones and delays any chemicals into their system, it drastically reduces the risk of addiction and also harm. Addiction and harm are two different things. If a person's addicted, yes, to suffer harm, but you don't have to be addicted to suffer harm from even just one-time use. All right. I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about higher risk drinkers. Higher risk drinkers are at a higher risk for emotional and a lot of different consequences. But what is a higher risk drinker? Why would we title somebody a higher risk drinker? Well, that is done when we perform surveys, and not just FCD, but across the board, monitoring the future, also surveys about 40 to 50,000 students each year. And when you look at a certain amount of alcohol use in a young person's life, then you also see in surveys a correlation between that use and a series of negative consequences. And I will explain further. Actually, let's do it right now. So, for example, here are some of the consequences of higher use drinking. 3/4 of students who are typically higher risk drinkers in this survey got sick, had a hangover. 2/3 forgot what happened while they were drinking. And when we say forgot what happened, not because they were passed out, they were actually awake, they were active while they were drinking, but the next day the brain has no memory. All right, so if you think about that for a second, that is actually brain damage right there. It's called alcohol-induced amnesia. But you can call it what you like. The bottom line is any chemical that prevents you from memorizing your reality obviously is doing some damage. But that's the physical damage. But what are the possible consequences of a young person forgetting what happened the next day? Right? So there are so many things that can happen in that young person's life that could change the course of their life forever, even just happening one time. Roughly 60% did something that they felt sorry for. Just about 4 in 10 rode as a passenger with an intoxicated driver. About 1/3 had trouble concentrating on homework. About 1/3 got into sexual situations they later regretted. And for something like that, that can be again change the whole perception of how one feels about oneself when you're a teenager. These are vital years of where they get to know themselves. They have a lot of insecurities as a young person. They need to be nurtured, they need to be cared for, and to be brought up into adulthood feeling as good about themselves as possible. Regretting a sexual situation is not healthy for a young person. And again, keeping this to the health perspective, this is not a moral issue, it's not a judgment on this young person, it's just to talk about the health issues that happen as a result of these behaviours. 54% drank alcohol or the use at home with their parents' knowledge, so in other words, half of the students who are higher risk drinkers, that is. Not all students, but the students who are higher risk drinkers, a lot of those students are allowed to drink at home. But here's the thing that's really important at the end. Even though they're higher risk drinkers, 94% of all students say that academics are very important to them. And when we look at the comparisons, now again, not every survey is the same, but this will be a typical survey where you will see that 51% of non-drinkers get mostly A's, where 35% of higher risk drinkers get mostly A's, and 40% of yearly or more frequent marijuana users get mostly A's. Now, if you look at that top line, that would make sense to you when you look at a non-drinker and a higher risk drinker. But there's a statistic I want you to focus on up here that's really worrisome, and that is this. If you look at A's, mostly A's and mostly B's, you're going to find that 97% of higher risk drinkers get mostly A's and B's. What does that say? Well, it's not what it says, it's what it doesn't say to the parents and what it doesn't say to the faculty of the teachers of these kids, and that is this, that grades are not necessarily an indicator of higher risk drinking. And so therefore, it's very easy to assume that if your child is getting A's and B's, and they're playing a sport and playing a musical instrument, but you know they're drinking, you can make the assumption that the alcohol is not affecting their life. But as a parent and as a teacher, you're not going to hear the students tell you about these negative consequences that are happening in the same lives as the 97% of the students who are getting A's and B's. So higher risk drinking typically leads to binge drinking in college. And the number one reason why students are asked to leave college or voluntarily flunk out of college is alcohol. So ultimately, what we're trying to do as an organisation and as a community is to make communities understand that just because you don't see a bunch of negative consequences in a young person's life, usually when you do see negative consequences in a young person's life regarding substances, that's way too far down the road. That child needed help way before that point. And so the whole idea of prevention is to try and look, as I said earlier, to look for those unhealthy behaviours that indicate to us that the student might be using these substances. All right? Non-drinkers are more likely to receive A's, and again, on this particular survey here, it was 94% of all students say academics are important to them. So what I'm showing you, by the way, are statistics from different surveys. When it comes to the social norms approach, this is what we would call maybe the backbone of our organisation. And what does that mean? It means that most everything we do, we talk through the social norms approach. Students consistently over-exaggerate and overestimate the use of substances among their peers. And why does that make a difference? Well, that makes a difference for this reason. Because we know, not just with substances, but with everything across society, that our perceptions about what we think is a norm drives our behaviour. So when an 8th grader entering high school feels internally or hears that the majority of students in the high school are using substances of any description, alcohol and other drugs, then that young person is at a higher risk for using themselves. Students growing up intuitively and internally want to belong to a group. That's a healthy peer pressure. It's a healthy internal peer pressure to want to fit in. If they see a group of what they deem successful students in high school, even see it, and there's alcohol use or other drug use, and they still deem that group to be successful, it lowers the risk associated with that substance and therefore making that substance more attractive to use and less of a threat to use. What we need to do and as a community is to make sure that the young people know that the majority of students are making healthy choices, and that for students who are not, ultimately there are negative consequences associated with that use. And so it's very important that we're able to understand as adults this situation, this information. So, what can parents do? As an organisation, we do not tell parents what to do. It's the last thing we do. But again, based on research, based on health-based information that we use all the time, and we're constantly looking for new information, this is what we found. All right? And a lot of this stuff might seem very obvious to you, and if it does, then that's a good sign. It means that you're probably incorporating this into your lives. When we say model healthy, appropriate attitudes and behaviours, is that sometimes parents ask me, is it okay to drink wine at the table? And the answer is, of course it is. But what we say is this: is there wine at the table 7 days a week? And if so, could you cut it back to 4 days and see what that looks like? See, is there any change in the family life? See, does your child notice that or not? In other words, whether there's wine at the table or not, there shouldn't be any difference in the chemistry within the family unit. Even if, for example, dad gets really funny after a few glasses of wine, we say that is not modeling a healthy behavior, because it ultimately teaches that kid that alcohol turns somebody into a funny character. So when we say model appropriate behaviours and healthy behaviours, we're saying about how much we drink in front of our young people. And when we say set clear limits, expectations and consequences, when a young person hears statements like be careful out there, don't do what I wouldn't do, and mind yourself, they are all ambiguous statements. Teenagers of all people really need clear instruction. If I was a soccer coach, for example, and I was training my team all week, and I had a game on Monday, the soccer coach is best served to say to their team, The team I'm looking at right now is the team I want to see on Monday, without any chemicals in between. That's a clear expectation from that coach. And the coach could even take it a step further and say, and if anybody in this team uses any substances between now and Monday, you have now left the team. You might be on the field, but you are not a team player. In other words, that's a clear expectation of that young person to be healthy as he can be or she can be, so that they can be their finest on Monday. And when a parent says to their child before they go out, they will say things like, it's my expectation that you're not going to be using any alcohol if you go over to your friend's house. And even if your child says, Mom, you've told me that 1,000 times, what we're saying is, that's good, all right? Because at the end of the day, we need to repeat these expectations all the time. Know what's going on after school, on weekends, during breaks, vacations, when stress is high. One of the, like if you ask, well not if you ask, I ask students consistently, hands up those of you who feel stressed at school, and typically most of the kids will put up their hands. Because school is a high pressure zone, there's they have an expectation of high academic achievement, and also they have a lot of studies which are primary to the brain, for things to learn, so therefore students feel stressed. But there are times when stress is higher than others. And one of them would be, for example, just before a school exam. And if you pick up on stress in your child's life and, for example, give them more attention around that time, the kid feels nurtured and also learn themselves, should I say, how to deal with stress. And when they themselves become a parent, they know instinctively what to do when a kid is stressed. Things like making them their favourite dinner, making them their favourite dessert, a lot of stuff like that, giving them ice cream when normally you might not, if the kid is stressed, is one way of what it does is it allows the kid to understand that you are aware of the fact that they're stressed. And the last one here says get to know their friends. And one of we could also add on to the end of that sentence, get to know their friends' parents, right? So inviting your daughter or son's friends into your home is a way of getting to know them. Invite them over for pizza, invite them over for dinner. You get to know your child's friends, but also if you know your child's friends' parents, then you can discuss your expectations and your policy regarding alcohol and other substance. And it makes it very clear then to other parents how you feel about this. And if you meet a parent who feels exactly like you, then you know that if your son or daughter is in their house, well then the risks of use is a lot lower than if you don't know that information. We're talking about eat together. Well, eating together, again, if you wanted to talk to your child about substance use, eating together is a good time. And if you wanted to set that up, or if the kid knew they were going to talk about that information, then what we're saying is it might be a good idea to produce, again, for them their favourite food, their favourite desserts. In other words, make it a communal event, making this conversation as easy as possible. It's not a case, I don't want you doing this and I don't want you doing that. It's okay to hear your students or your sons and daughters' thoughts. For example, okay, we talk with our teens about alcohol and other drugs, but this one here is really important. Listen to your teens' thoughts about alcohol and other drugs. If your child says, Mom, you don't know anything about marijuana, it's organic and it cures cancer, well, when you hear that information, that might set you off. But what we're saying is, before you respond, before you react, just take a breath and just say to yourself, okay, let's talk about that. Because ultimately, when the student says something that's not necessarily a fact or true, we want them to be able to talk again in a couple of weeks' time. So what we're suggesting is, as much as you want to maybe shut down some conversations or some thoughts that your daughter or son says to you, ultimately you want that conversation to continue. So just probing, well, where did you hear that? What site did you go to see that? Who told you that? So let's investigate. Grab the iPad and let's see what it says on a reputable site. So in other words, just let's unpack any thought that they might have. And when we say continue to share your thoughts and concerns, it's really important that this message is said over and over again, because ultimately a 14-year-old might have a completely different mindset than when they're 16 years of age. And we can't assume because we've told them many times that they now have got it. It's really important to understand that not every one of our kids are the same. Not every one of our kids' prefrontal cortex develops at the same rate. So what we say as an organisation, we say that things like, it's really a good idea as a parent to be your daughter or son's prefrontal cortex, because your 17-year-old might be far more mature than your 19-year-old. So giving kids equal time might not necessarily work in this situation. Being there for your daughter or son is really important, and of course spending time with them as you can. This basically is the last slide of our presentation, and what it says this: research shows that parents, so it said our youth, students that perceive that their parents disapprove of their use of addictive substances and are also involved in their day-to-day activities. Young people who have parents like that are statistically less likely to use alcohol or other drugs than students who do not have those two protective factors in their lives. And so, you know, when we say prevention is a climate and not a program, families, peers, schools and communities are all key components in prevention. And regarding resources, please feel free to check us out at fcd.org, send us an email at schools@fcd.org. Our office is not that big. We have less than 10 people in our office. Your emails will get responded to in a very timely fashion. Feel free to join in on our conversation. We also got the National Institution of Drug Abuse website is right there, Partnership for Drug-Free Kids, and Above the Influence. Lots of good information here for you folks to look at. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions or comments after this presentation.